Hi everyone, this is Richard. So, I was never very good at programming to begin with, but it has been a few years since I even touched a bit of code at all. So, I'm going to start trying to learn how to program again. And if you don't know anything about programming at all whatsoever, welcome. Maybe we can learn this together, okay? And I'll document my journey step by step so you will know everything that I know all the way through, all right? Let's start in C Sharp. C Sharp is a great programming language. It's a great language for starting. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. And it's a great programming language for developing on top of that. And let's go over everything. Again, if you know absolutely zero about programming, thank you for coming here, okay? So this is Visual Studio. I'm not going to go through the install of Visual Studio because I think it's pretty straightforward. If it's not straightforward, if you're having some problems, please, leave a comment in the comment section and we can actually do a video on installing it. You can install this on any version of GNU Linux, Windows, even Mac. Under like the Linux, you'd have to use something like Visual Studio Code as opposed to Visual Studio. Not the same thing. If, again, you're having some difficulty, Visual Studio is no cost, the community version. But if you're having some troubles or something like that with installing it, again, let me know. Let's install this, and I'm going to create a new project. Excuse me. And under C Sharp, I'm going to type in console. And there's several console apps. So this is just a template that we're going to start with, okay? You see C Sharp here, VB, C Sharp, .NET Framework. What you want to do is this one, not the .NET Framework, okay? So not the F Sharp or anything like that. This is the one you want. Click on it, next. And I'm going to put it under the folder C Apps and place solution in the same directory, okay? That was my custom application folder. And .NET 6.0 long-term, okay? You might be watching this video later. Just get the latest framework. All right, let's see what we got here. Okay, so we have this on the screen itself. If you hit console app right here, it'll give you the output down here. Actually, it gets you the output over here. Hello world. Okay, so that is the first program that we made. Actually, we didn't make it, but it's close enough. All right, press any key to continue. So let's talk about a few things before we even talk into programming at all whatsoever, okay? And I will talk about all of this stuff up here as well. But let's talk from the very, very beginning, all right? C Sharp is what we call a high-level programming language, okay? So what that simply means, so you'll hear about all sorts of different programming languages, and there's like a low level, high level. On the very, for my sake, on the very high level, it just means that the program is doing a lot for you. So it gives you a lot of help and assistance. You don't have to interface, you don't have to work with the hardware directly. That's perfectly fine. You don't have to deal with a lot of other really specific details because, again, the program, the C Sharp programming language really helps you along the way and does a lot of things, makes some assumptions for you so that you can go ahead and type your program easily. But so it doesn't mean much about that. So the really low-level programming languages would be something like assembly. The other high levels would be like higher level, but lower than C Sharp would be like C programming language. But like C Sharp and Java, Python, those would be higher level languages. Very good languages to learn insofar, at least in my opinion. Of course, that's coming from somebody who's just learning it, right? But anyway, let's talk about what is Visual Studio. That's what we call an IDE or a editor is another term for some of these things. IDE is Integrated Development Environment. An editor is basically a mini IDE, where you draw that line between IDE, where you draw the line between an IDE and an editor. I don't really know, but Visual Studio Code would be the editor. IDE would be something like Visual Studio. It just has more bells and whistles. It has more features to help you along the way. That's all, okay? Then let's take a look here. And then when we talked about running this thing, we talked about we saw before it was .NET 6.0, right? What .NET is, it's either like .NET or .NET. .NET is what we call a framework. Okay, the .NET framework, it's not called .NET framework, it's just called .NET. Okay, there is such a thing as .NET framework. That was a previous version, now it's just called .NET. But if we're talking about frameworks in general, what a framework is, it's basically a big huge program that helps you write your own programs. Right? So it's a computer program that helps you write a program. It's kind of like if you used a word processor. The word processor is a program that helps you type things and type an essay or something, right? So it's the same idea. That's what a framework does, is it helps you, at least in this context, it helps you write your programming languages with some features. And we'll talk about the features in just a second, okay? When we talk about a platform, okay, so let's get these terms, like a framework and then a platform. When we refer to a platform, we're typically talking about where the program is run. So in other words, the platform would be something like Mac OS or Windows or Linux or Android or iOS or something like that. So those would be called the platforms. So if you want to run this on a specific platform, that's what people are talking about, okay? If this is too basic for you, I'm really sorry, but I want to make sure that if you know absolutely nothing, again, we're learning some information right here, okay? Then there's the type of language. I think we need to get these definitions out there. I think it's super important when you're first learning. At least it was for me. When you're first learning about certain types of languages, you will hear terms like compiler or compile. Okay, so compiler is the program. Compile is what the program does. Another term is like a translator. Okay, so what are these? What these do is when you type out console.writeline hello world, this is the program, but the computer actually doesn't read that. What it does is it gets this and it converts it into something, ones and zeros basically, into a way in which the processor, the computer, can actually understand and run and give you some output. That's what's happening. So what we do is when we hit this button right here, it compiles, it changes. Okay, what a compiler does is it changes the language that you wrote, C#, into the language that the computer can actually read, ones and zeros, which is called a binary. Binary meaning two, either a 0 or a 1. So it converts it into that and it allows it to run. And so what this part of the .NET does is it compiles, changes this into a binary. Okay? Other programming languages uses something like a translator where you get their code and you convert it into, and you run it on top of this framework also, their frameworks. What's the difference between a translator and a compiler? I'm not exactly sure. I'm going to be honest with you. So translators have a tendency of being a little slower, but compilers a little bit faster. There's something called adjust JIT or adjust in time compiler versus AOT, ahead of time. So what happens with the JIT is you get this program and it runs it, it converts it as it reads down the list. It converts this step by step into the language that the computer can actually read. What an ahead of time compiler does is it gets the entire program, it converts it into a binary, right? Binary here, so that the computer can read the whole thing. So it doesn't need to be compiled again. So one is being compiled as it's being run, as you run the program. The other is ahead of time. It's compiled already, and then you can run it. Which one is C#? Okay, so C# is a little bit in between, all right? So what it actually does is it gets your typed words, you convert it into something called CLR. Actually, hang on a second. So in other words, that is a common language runtime. So you get this CLR, okay? You get this program, you convert it into a common language runtime. The common language, it converts into CIL, Common Intermediate Language. Okay, Common Intermediate Language. And so the Common Intermediate Language gets converted into the binary itself on top. All right, so I may be getting a little confusing inside of here, so let's see if we can run this down. Okay, you get the program, you push this, it turns it into a Common Intermediate Language. The Common Intermediate Language gets then sent through a Common Language Runtime. That's what I was meant to say. By the way, none of this stuff you have to know. I think it's just nice to know. Okay, so feel free to skip ahead, all right? So Common Intermediate Language gets converted into the Common Language Runtime, and the runtime is what runs it on the given platform. So this will be the same regardless. The CIL, the Common Intermediate Language, will be the same basically for any platform, but the Common Language Runtime will be specific to the platform itself, right? The platform being where the program is run. Again, Windows, Linux, Mac OS, or whatever. Okay? So all of this is part of the .NET framework. I keep saying framework. It is a framework, but it's just, again, called .NET. All right? FYI, I think it was before .NET 5. I think before .NET 4 was called .NET Core. Okay? It was previously called .NET Core. This is just branding, okay? This is just the naming of it. You don't need to know this. It's just FYI type of stuff. .NET Core, and the previous versions of this was called .NET Framework. So if you hear about somebody talk about .NET Framework, that is no longer being, I think it's supported, but it's no longer being used commonly. Any new programs will be run under either .NET Core or just call it .NET, and people will understand what you're saying. If you say .NET Framework, they'll think that you're using the older versions of this program. All right, so just keep that in mind. It's .NET or .NET Core. Just .NET 6 or .NET 7 or whatever. That's what you want to say. All right, finally, you'll hear some other terms like the CLI or the MSIL, okay? Microsoft Intermediate Language, same thing as the Common Intermediate Language, all right? And all of these put together would be the CLI, Common Language Infrastructure, okay? Structure. So the Common Language Infrastructure, CLI, includes you convert this text into the CIL or MSIL. The Common Language Infrastructure includes both of these two things. So when you say you run this through your CLI, that's what you're talking about. And then you run it through the Common Language Runtime. And again, the reason why I'm going through these is you might see all these words and say, what the heck does that even mean? It's a good idea to get an understanding before we even learn how to program, okay? But we will get there. Finally, I think I wanted to mention something about, you'll hear about libraries, like a toolkit, APIs. What's an API? API is an application programming interface. All of these are basically pre-made programs that you could use over and over again, but somebody else made them so that you don't have to. So part of programming is super important. You don't have to do everything yourself. In fact, you shouldn't do everything yourself. You shouldn't create a program from scratch. You use programs, you build it on top of what other people do to really simplify it. For example, like if you're writing a book, you write the book and you type things out, but you don't literally make the book, right? You don't cut down the trees and make the paper and make the ink. You don't do it. That's all done for you. Right? So libraries, toolkits, API, basically it's the same thing. Whenever you hear that, it's all the same thing. It's programs that other people made that you can actually use to help you along the way with your program. Okay? So I think that's about it for the definitions. Now that we set this up, let's go in the next video about advancing with this basic knowledge into how to actually program. Okay? Thanks.